and welcome to the first in a four-part dyslexia video series. The International Dyslexia Association, the Georgia Reading League, and the Georgia Department of Education have partnered to bring you this webinar series. The series was developed through a partnership between the Georgia Department of Education and the Mary Frances Early College of Education at the University of Georgia. Our speakers this evening are Dr. Kristen Sayeski and Dr. Jennifer Lindstrom. Both are on faculty at the University of Georgia. And I want to go ahead and get started so we can get to your questions. And if you have additional questions, many of you have already submitted questions, please put them in the chat. We have people that are moderating the chat, and we'll add those during the Q&A session. So without further ado, welcome Dr. Lindstrom and Dr. Sayeski.
Thank you.
I think, Jennifer, you're going to start.
Yes, welcome everybody, and thank you for coming. I know that we have people here from Georgia and well beyond the state of Georgia, so thank you for taking the time to tune in this evening. We are going to be, as Kim already mentioned, this is a four-part series that we'll be looking at the first of the four videos, what is dyslexia? And so we'll be showing different segments of the video, and then Dr. Sayeski will be unraveling the content of that. And then I will be addressing other questions that frequently come up regarding dyslexia in the schools, and then we'll take additional questions.
Great, thank you, Jennifer. All right, so before we dive in, first of all, I want to thank IDA Georgia, the Reading League of Georgia, and the Georgia Department of Education, the Georgia Department of Education for creating this opportunity for us to really explore the series. When I was first developing these videos, my goal was to create these 10-minute snapshots about what is dyslexia and key concepts related to dyslexia. And for the most part, I hit my mark. You'll see if you've seen the series so far, or if you've previewed some of the series, you'll see by the time I get to the fourth video in the series, on the topic of reading instruction and structured literacy, the concepts are very detailed, and they kept expanding. So by the time we were done with that video, it resulted in a 20-minute video. So this series is really nice because in the development of each of the videos, some of the ideas really needed to be truncated just for efficiency's sake. And this video series will allow us to dive a little deeper and get into some more detail regarding some of the ideas related to dyslexia and reading instruction, particularly for those who struggle or have difficulty learning to read. Finally, before we get into the videos, I did want to give a shout out to Anthony Andros, and he did all of the web design for this video series and is also the voice of the Dyslexia video series. So I appreciate the work that he did in really bringing these videos and this content to life. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get into the videos. As Jennifer mentioned, the way that this is going to work is we're just going to have about 3 minutes. We're going to show 3-minute segments of the video, and then we'll dive in. And some of you submitted questions in advance. So in my response and in Jennifer's response, we'll provide some answers to those questions as well as provide some additional detail about the video. So let's go ahead. And we'll begin with the first clip.
And we cannot hear the audio.
Welcome to the first video in our dyslexia series, What is Dyslexia? This video series was developed through a partnership between the Georgia Department of Education and the Mary Frances Early College of Education at the University of Georgia. Upon completion of this video, you will be able to define and know the primary characteristics of dyslexia. In addition, We will dispel dyslexia-related myths and take a peek inside the reading brain. In 2019, the Georgia legislature passed Senate Bill 48 to provide support for the identification and education of students with dyslexia in elementary and secondary schools. The primary purposes of Georgia's Senate Bill 48 were to ensure that teachers across the state were knowledgeable about dyslexia, school districts had the resources they needed to identify students with dyslexia, and students with dyslexia would receive the type of instructional support they required. Passage of Senate Bill 48 would result in the development of a handbook, the creation of the dyslexia endorsement, which all teachers in Georgia can earn, and the establishment of pilot districts to evaluate the effectiveness of early reading assistance for students with characteristics of dyslexia. Why did state legislators think Georgia needed such a bill? By fourth grade, 65% of students fail to achieve above a basic level of reading. An alarming 34% of all fourth grade students score below basic levels. It is estimated that 1 out of 10 students experience persistent difficulty in learning to read. These students are considered to have reading disabilities. Students with reading disabilities can receive special education services under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act under the category of specific learning disability. Approximately 33% of students with IEPs are served under the category of specific learning disabilities. The federal definition of a specific learning disability is a disorder in one or more basic psychological processes involved in understanding or in using language, spoken or written, that may manifest itself in the imperfect ability to listen, think, speak, read, write, spell, or to do mathematical calculations, including conditions such as perceptual disabilities, brain injury, minimal brain dysfunction, dyslexia, and developmental aphasia. As you can see, dyslexia is one type of specific learning disability a student can have. As a matter of fact, the majority of students who have learning disabilities have difficulty learning to read. Smaller percentages of students with learning disabilities have difficulty with mathematics and writing. These conditions can also overlap. To review, 65% of fourth graders are not proficient in reading. Approximately 1 out of 10 students will experience persistent difficulty learning to read. Students with dyslexia can qualify for special education services, and students with dyslexia are served under the category of specific learning disability.
So in this first segment, there are a couple of key points that we wanted to make and that really are important for understanding why this piece of legislation came about in the first place. And one is that there might be a general perception that the majority of kids are doing just fine when it comes to reading, and the type of reading instruction that's provided is doing well by most students. And yet when we look at national data and we look at what's called the NAEP data, we'll see that 65% of fourth graders are not proficient in reading. And so what that means is that the majority of kids really are not learning how to read in this country. And that's really problematic, particularly by fourth grade. That's pretty alarming. When we start breaking down, obviously 65% of fourth graders in the United States do not have dyslexia. And so when we really look at who are those kids who are experiencing persistent difficulty in learning to read, we'll see that about 1 in 10 of students truly are having some kind of neurobiological issue in terms of really learning how to read. And finally, when we think about who are these kids who are experiencing persistent difficulty in learning to read, what is their eligibility? And there's a common misperception sometimes that special education is separate from the needs and services that a student with dyslexia might be receiving, but that's not true. So students with dyslexia are eligible to receive special education services. And again, in the third video in our series, we dive a lot more into that, the logistics of that, and what are the specifications for being eligible for that. But just know that students with dyslexia can receive services under the IDEA for special education. One of the things that I get asked about frequently when I talk about the NAEP data, and the NAEP data might be something that you'll hear about or you'll read about frequently when we're talking about the issue of how students are doing in this country when it comes to reading, and this alarming statistic of 65% of fourth graders, which, by the way, has been a very stable percentage over the years. So we haven't gotten a whole lot better in teaching students to read over the years. So these data began to be collected, the reading data, in 1992, and really we haven't seen tremendous change in really reducing this number and getting a handle on this issue in terms of reading instruction. But what should be really cause for alarm for most of us is when we dive into these data and understand what they really mean. And to do that, we're going to look at the cut points on the NAEP scale. And so you'll see here that students there's a cut point for proficient. And so students who are above this cut point are above proficient, above advanced. And again, you'll see the majority of students in this country are below proficient at fourth grade in reading. And the NAEP test is a standardized test. So you can imagine the students are going to read a passage and then they're going to answer some questions. So frequently people ask me, wasn't that really an assessment of comprehension? But in 2018, they did an oral reading study related to the NAEP. And what they did was they took 1,800 fourth graders, and they from about 180 different public schools. And after they gave them the NAEP test, the written test, they then gave them an oral fluency measure. And what those data showed is what a lot of people would predict, that if you are not a fluent reader, if you are not able to recognize and read words in isolation, then you are not going to be able to score well on the NAEP. And indeed, that's exactly what they found, is that a significant number of students who scored at this below basic level simply weren't able to decode words. They simply weren't able to then achieve any kind of reading fluency with either reading words in isolation or reading connected text. Again, another surprising, or not surprising, but concerning thing that came out of that study was that students who performed in this basic level, so just below proficient, who may be at the basic level, also did poorly on measures of word reading. So again, it points to an issue that we're not doing a particularly strong job in terms of reading instruction, in terms of teaching kids how to read words. And I glance over at the chat every now and then because I see any questions coming in. Another issue that comes up and that people ask me about is how many individuals have dyslexia. What's the percentage, or what's the likelihood of a kid having a percentage? And actually, one of the questions that came in before this webinar started was how many people have dyslexia in the United States. So I Googled that. And those ranges go from, if you're looking at a more conservative estimate of 5% up to a more percentage of maybe naturally occurring or recurring as a result of poor instruction, maybe more 15%. Those numbers can range from 14.5 million to 43.5 million people. So this is not an insignificant issue, and it's not an insignificant issue in the United States, this issue of reading difficulty. So what you will hear frequently is this 1 in 5 number. So I think the National Center for Learning Disabilities does it. I know Shaywitz will talk about it. Decoding Dyslexia will talk about the 1 in 5. Typically, when those organizations are talking about people, that definition is going to be a little inclusive of individuals who have attention, and also maybe more reflective of the current state of the population. If we look at more conservative estimates from research, you'll see maybe that estimate might be closer to really 1 in 5 students. If students are receiving appropriate instruction, it's going to be 1 in 5 that are really going to experience some persistent difficulty in learning to read. So let's go ahead. So that's just the basic kind of landscape of, where we are in terms of numbers, why this is an issue. And now we'll dive into our next segment.
Dyslexia definitions and myths. The most commonly adopted definition of dyslexia was developed by the International Dyslexia Association. Dyslexia is a specific learning disability that is neurobiological in origin. It is characterized by difficulties with accurate and/or fluent word recognition and by poor spelling and decoding abilities. These difficulties typically result from a deficit in the phonological component of language that is often unexpected in relation to other cognitive abilities and the provision of effective classroom instruction. Secondary consequences may include problems in reading comprehension and reduced reading experience that can impede growth of vocabulary and background knowledge. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual also provides a definition of dyslexia. Dyslexia is an alternative term used to refer to a pattern of learning difficulties characterized by problems with accurate or fluent word recognition, poor decoding, or poor spelling abilities. Thus, all definitions of dyslexia highlight difficulty with word recognition and spelling as primary characteristics. These difficulties are not caused by visual acuity problems or low intelligence. That means dyslexia is not caused by problems with vision or how the eyes work. Special glasses or eye training will not help individuals with dyslexia. Also, many people believe that people with dyslexia read backwards or the letters jump around on the page visually. While it is true that some individuals with dyslexia will consistently mix up their P's, B's, D's, and Q's, the true difficulty lies within their ability to connect the sounds of language to letters and letter combinations. To review, dyslexia is neurobiological in origin and characterized by difficulty with word recognition and spelling. Dyslexia is not caused by problems with vision, and individuals with dyslexia do not read backwards. We often refer to students with learning disabilities as having unexpected difficulty with learning. These students are otherwise bright, whether it's contributing ideas or coming up with creative problem-solving approaches, but experience frustration and difficulty decoding the words on a page. So, a reading disability is neurological in origin and makes it difficult for otherwise bright individuals to learn how to read. But what exactly is going on in the brains of individuals with dyslexia? Dyslexia definitions and myths.
All right. So when we talk about what is dyslexia, there are a lot of different definitions that are out there. One of the most commonly used definitions comes from IDEA, and the IDEA definition was adopted in 2002. It's the definitions that's used by most states when they're looking at your dyslexia laws or pieces of state legislation related to dyslexia that have passed in the last 8 to 10 years. But it's also the one that's used by researchers, and that guides a lot of how we talk and we think about individuals with dyslexia. So there are 4 components that I want to just touch on a little bit with each one of these. And first of all, within the IDEA definition, it's recognized that dyslexia is a specific learning disability. So again, to go back to special education law, it's recognized as one of those under one of those categories of disability that's served under special education law, which is a specific learning disability. The second part of the definition that is really important is that it's neurobiological in origin. And in this, the definition recognizes that there is a neurobiological basis for this. And indeed, we're going to talk about some brain imaging, both later in the video and in this presentation, where there is a clear neurobiological signature for kids or individuals with dyslexia. So when we look at the brain scans of individuals with dyslexia, that pattern of functioning when they're attempting to read is going to be consistent across a lot of people who have dyslexia. And that picture is also different from what it looks like in the brains of individuals who are reading fluently or reading well. The second part is really one of the most important and most misunderstood components of dyslexia, and that is that a majority of students who have dyslexia have difficulty with phonology, and that is the processing of speech sounds. And so I'm going to spend a second or two talking about that on the next slide. Right now, I am currently working on a book on the topic of dyslexia. And when I talk to people about my book that are not in the field of reading disabilities, I'll say, oh, I'm writing a book about dyslexia. And so immediately they're going to say, oh, you should write the title backwards, or, oh, that's kids who do backwards spelling. It is probably the number one response that I get when I say that I study, I look at, or I work in the field of dyslexia. And most people don't understand that dyslexia really primarily is an issue with phonology, and for the majority of kids with dyslexia have difficulty with phonology. And then finally, the IDA definition recognizes that word recognition is also tied to the acquisition of knowledge. And so when you read, you learn things and you gain vocabulary and you gain insights into the world. And so kids who are not reading and they're not able to lift the words off the page and decode words, then they're limited, they're getting less access to that knowledge. And so there is a relationship. Sometimes we talk about having a secondary consequence. I think that's within the definitions, a secondary consequence of not being able to read is then having difficulty with comprehension because you have less access to that information and content. All right. So I will spend just a minute or two talking about phonology because it is key and critical for understanding dyslexia and also understanding what's happening in the brains of individuals with dyslexia. But to do that, I'm going to back up just 2 steps. And one is to define reading in a very particular way. And so when I'm talking about reading, we're talking about the act of translating print, the act of translating written words, written things into then words that you know. So we're going to translate print, and what we're going to call print is we're going to call print orthography. So the way that any language is written is called its orthography. So if I was to write in Japanese, I could write in, could use some kanji, which is going to be their logographic script, and some kana, which is going to be their syllabary. And that script, there are those things are going to be, if I don't know those and how to read those, I'm not going to be able to connect those to words if I can't read those. English is not written with a logography or a syllabary. It's an alphabetic language. And so what that means is that in an alphabetic language, individual speech sounds are represented by letters or letter combinations. And so in order for someone to learn to read English, the English orthography, they've got to, first of all, be able to hear those speech sounds, and then they have to map them to letters. In English, we've got speech sounds like the t, and we map those to the letters M, A, and T, and we can blend those to read words. What we know about English is it's tricky. And so there's not always that one-on-one correspondence between a speech sound and its letters, and this creates some challenge. And this is why it can be challenging to teach reading and why it's difficult for kids to learn to read, but it doesn't mean it's impossible. And it certainly means that if we do it in careful and systematic ways, that we really can unlock this code for individuals. Again, some of our sounds are very consistent and they're represented in one way, like the sound B is going to be represented by a B, but some sounds like F might be represented by an F, a PH, a GH. And so kids are going to have to learn those correspondences in order to read an alphabetic language. The beauty of an alphabetic language is once you know what those are, you can read any word. You're just going to have to begin to apply what you know about that code to novel words that you encounter. So let's go back to our individuals with dyslexia and what this issue of phonology really means. And so in order, if you have difficulty with phonology, you're going to have difficulty ungluing speech sounds. So when we talk, I can say, I'm going to get that. And I probably didn't even pause like at all, even between my whole words. So we're not even pausing in between whole words, and we certainly are not pausing in between individual sounds. We, as a matter of fact, we co-articulate them, so we sound them together. So it's really hard to pull those sounds apart. So if I were to ask you, what is, or let's just say I were to ask a child with dyslexia, what's the first sound in bat? They would have difficulty separating that B sound. They most likely will just say bat. Right? If you ask them for the first sound, they might say ba. But again, separating that B out there from that word is going to be very, very difficult. So when we talk about kids with dyslexia having a primary difficulty with phonology, that's it. They're having difficulty really hearing those sounds and then being able to manipulate them, which you're going to need to do to map them to those spelling patterns or to those letter patterns. So that is the first issue. And then the second issue, it can come in when it comes to mapping those letters and letter patterns. And so again, so kids who are not getting some direct and explicit instruction, they'll never be able to do it. But when even when you're getting some of that instruction, you might need to be a little bit more explicit in making that, and you're going to have a little bit more repetition and a little more practice to make those connections. So there, I've talked about kind of what phonology is. When we go back to that IDA definition, they're going to say the majority of kids with dyslexia are going to have difficulty with phonology. The DSM is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, and this is used by clinical and school psychologists when they're making a diagnosis, or I should say clinical psychologist. Jennifer will get me on that one. When they're making a diagnosis of dyslexia. And so what this manual says is when you are giving a battery of assessment to students, here are things that you need to look at. And I like this definition because it gives us an opportunity to talk about some terms that can get a little bit confusing, but that we get even more information on in the second video. And that is this difference between word recognition and decoding. And so word recognition, according to the DSM-V, is it's just going to be your automatic whole word recognition. So if you are a fluent reader, most of the time when you're reading along, you're just recognizing automatically words. When we look in the brain, you're actually paying attention to all of the letters. There's kind of a myth out there that people don't even pay attention to all the letters and words, but we do, because if we didn't pay attention, you couldn't automatically know the difference between friend and fiend. So your brain is very quickly processing every one of those letters in that word, but you're recognizing it whole word. If you come to, you're reading a scientific text or you're reading a legal document, you will get to a word that you don't recognize and you're going to have to decode it and you're going to have to sound it out and process it. So when we talk about kids with dyslexia having word level difficulty, reading difficulty, we're talking about both. They don't have word recognition of automatic whole words, but they also have difficulty or unable to decode words and use their knowledge of phonics to figure words out. And then finally, when we're doing an assessment and diagnosis for dyslexia, we'll also look at the spelling ability, because that's going to get some insight into, can they separate those phonemes out, and then what is their knowledge of these spelling patterns that they can map it to, and we can get some insight into both phonology and their mastery of that mapping. All right. So then we'll finally get to some of these persistent myths. And one is that individuals with dyslexia do not read backwards. And I'm going to show you a little study that was done that I think is really interesting that sheds some light on this. One of the questions that came in before the webinar began was this issue of mirror writing and backward writing. And so we're going to talk about that in just a minute. But really very quickly, that we know that reversals are common in most children, but that things like special glasses and things like that's not a matter in terms of what you're seeing. If a kid cannot see, that is one thing. And certainly we have all experienced kids. I was one of those that went off to kindergarten and my mother had no idea that I couldn't see anything. And so I got glasses in kindergarten. So that is not an issue with dyslexia, but we'll talk about this issue of kind of reversals or mirror writing. And then the next one that gets a little bit fuzzy for some people is, although many people might hear, oh, dyslexia, you're just being lazy, or you're just not very bright. What we do know, and we have known historically for hundreds of years, that there is, often we see this unexpected inability to read. So you have these otherwise bright kids, you're talking to them, they're picking up on things, they're doing great, they're figuring all these other things out, and yet why can't they read? And so it really does seem to be unexplained. So that certainly are the cases where we can very clearly see that there's something going on with this kid that's not right. But we also know from brain imaging research and from studies on dyslexia that dyslexia is independent of cognition. So you can have dyslexia and have a lower scale in terms of IQ or IQ and cognition. So dyslexia is independent of cognition. And again, we'll see that the majority of kids who have dyslexia have average to above average IQ intelligence. All right, so let's talk about reversals just for a second, because they are so fascinating and they just capture everyone's imagination. And so I stole this study from Duhan, and Stanislas Duhan is a French cognitive neurobiologist. And he does all kinds of brain imaging work. We're going to hear from him in just a second. But he talked about this study in his book, Reading in the Brain. And what was done in this particular study was that there were two sisters. There was Lizzie, who was 5, and Maggie, who was 6. And so they were sisters. And what the researcher asked them to do was, I'm going to put a dot on a page and I want you to write your name. So I drew these little blue lines here to show you that this was the side of the page. So here's the dot right here at the edge of the page. And so Lizzie wrote her name, 5. Maggie, 6, wrote her name. But then here's the other side of the page. He wrote the dot. So Lizzie does what she does. She starts at the dot and she writes her name, but it's mirror. Her sister Maggie, who's so much older and wiser, realizes I don't have enough space, backs it up and writes from left to right. And so you'll see this again on a couple different pages. Every time he did a dot, if there was no room to write, Lizzie would write her name backwards. And so what we do know about this mirror writing is that it's very developmentally natural. And as a matter of fact, we look down here at the slide, for kids that are under 5 years of age, they can do both. They go flow back and forth. They can, write left to right and then right to left, and it's not a problem. By about 5 to 6 years of age, you'll begin to see this beginning to decrease, but still quite a few 5 and 6-year-olds still can do this mirror writing back and forth very, very well. By the time the kid gets to 6 or 7 years old, you're going to see this huge drop in it. And so what's happening is we're correcting the brain, or as Duhan would say, we've got some neuronal recycling going on. And so the brain is actually rewiring itself. And so this mirror imaging thing that you used to do, your brain's saying, we don't need that anymore. And we certainly don't need that for this task. And so we're no longer being able to do that. So not only is this going away, you really just can't do it. If you try, you can try. And then finally, by 7 to 8 years of age, it's almost gone completely. And students over 8 years, really, this mirror writing is gone. What we do see in a very small subset of the population of individuals with dyslexia, that they persist in having some reversals. They persist in having reversals in their writing, probably not full-on mirror writing, but you're going to see some reversals. So this is not a sign. People say, oh, is this a red flag, or is this an indicator that this is dyslexia? It's not an indicator, but it is something that we do see that persist. And I think one of the questions too is kind of in terms of remediating that. And one of the first things you'll want to do is you think about some OT, or have they done some letter formation kind of work? So if they has that individual had any kind of direct and explicit instruction in letter formation, because again, this notion of brain plasticity and the brain can rewire itself with some direct instruction and some practice, you can see a reduction in some of those reversals that happen within writing.
Dyslexia in the brain. First, here's a picture of a brain of a person without a reading disability. Notice that 3 areas of the brain are activated: Broca's area, the parieto-temporal lobe, and the occipito-temporal region. Note that each of these areas perform a slightly different function to assist with reading. When a person without a reading disability reads, blood flows to these areas, and this activity can be detected using fMRI technology. The more blood that flows to the area, the bigger the circle and the more work that area is doing. In contrast, we can look at the brain of a person who has dyslexia. Individuals with dyslexia have less activation of the parieto-temporal and occipito-temporal regions. In addition, researchers have found overactivation of other regions of the brain. Thus, a person with a reading disability is attempting to do a very complex task using less efficient pathways than skilled readers. Brain imaging research is exciting because it verifies the relationship between phonological differences and difficulty with learning to read, and it has allowed us to test the effects of specific reading interventions in relationship to brain functioning. Studies have shown that when students with reading disabilities are provided with reading instruction that emphasize phonology and decoding, patterns in brain activation change. These changes in brain activity are associated with gains in decoding skills. To review, findings from neurological research confirms that dyslexia is real and that reading intervention can help. But what are the characteristics of someone with dyslexia?
So now we're going to do a little more Duhan, and I was going to explain this graph a little bit, and then I decided to just borrow a clip of Duhan. So what I'm going to show you now, it's going to be a little bit hard to read because it is dark, but the image becomes clear as the video goes through. And we're going to listen to Duhan, and Duhan's giving this speech several years ago. I think this was 2013, and you can find this video on YouTube. And well, actually, we'll make sure that you guys get the link to it because it's a really interesting video. But what you're going to see in this video is you are going to see what the actual fMRI technology looks like as the brain is reading a word. And you'll hear Stanislaus Duhan, Dr. Duhan, explaining this video and talking about what's happening in the brain. So here's a very brief clip of Dr. Duhan.
Well, this is a picture of your left hemisphere. The left hemisphere of the brain is most essential for language and reading. And just to orient you, this is the back of the brain. This is the front of the brain. It's been slightly inflated, so you can see inside the folds. And now I want to show you the activation of the brain as you read one word. We see it in time. So let me start this. Here we go. And you have the word unfolding from the back of the brain to the front of the brain. It will loop several times. You can see the information enters into the occipital pole, which is the visual side of the brain, moves into the ventral areas, and then explodes into the left hemisphere distributed activity. I have no time, of course, to explain to you all of the details of this brain activity, but I want to show you a sort of caricature that you can remember. And it's very simply that reading starts as any other visual stimulation in these generic visual areas of the occipital pole of the brain, but then very quickly moves into an area that we have discovered, which concentrates the recognition of the written word. I have called it the brain's letterbox, because it is where we store our knowledge of letters. And from there, what you have seen is this explosion of activity into at least 2 networks, one that concerns the meaning of the words, and another that concerns the pronunciation and the articulation of the word. And so we can say essentially from the brain's point of view that learning to read consists first in recognizing the letters and how they combine into written words, and second, connecting them to these systems coding for speech sounds and for meaning. And what is rather remarkable is that all of the areas in orange and in green here already exist for spoken language. They are shared between spoken language and written language. So not only that, but they already exist in a young child.
So I'm going to go back to Duhan's original picture here. So what Duhan's showing there, first of all, is that, we can see that when an individual reads a word, it's first activated, the visual input, and then it's got to go through, and it's where this orthographic code is on the video right here with the orthographic code, which he calls the letter box, because that's where the brain is processing these letters and letter combinations. And then if you know that word, it's a word that you have seen before, it's going to come right here to this top-down series, and you're going to immediately then be able to attach that to the phonology. You're going to know the pronunciation of it, and you're going to be able to connect it to the meaning of the word. If you do not know the word and you're sounding it out, you're going to be then also connecting it to the articulation and phonology, and you're trying to figure that out. And then as you figure that out, then you'll also be bringing meaning to that. So this image of the brain and how the brain is working when you are reading and when you are a fluent reader, reading very clearly shows that we both need to figure out the phonology. We need to map those letters to the phonology of the word, and then we bring meaning to the word, and that's where really reading comprehension occurs, and where understanding of what it is that we just read occurs within the brain. Going back to the video and what you saw there in terms of that more simplified image of the brain, which I like to think of as the Shaywitz brain, you'll see that when we look at brain activation patterns of individuals with dyslexia, you're not seeing that same systematic flow of information. In fact, what you're seeing in Duhan's image that you just saw, and in most typically developing readers, all of the activation, the majority of the activation in the brain occurs in the left hemisphere. What happens when an individual with dyslexia is asked to read things, you're not going to see that same flow of information. Instead, you're going to see underactivation in some of those back areas that's really responsible for mapping the letterbox, which is essential for reading. And instead, you're going to see other areas of the brain trying to compensate, trying to figure out a way to read this word. And as a matter of fact, you're going to see activation in the right hemisphere, which is what the brain does when it kind of doesn't know how to figure out information. It kind of creates these new spots. And so we'll see just less efficient processing, which is why reading can be tiring and more slow and laborious and more difficult for individuals, because their brain just isn't processing the information as efficiently. What is the most exciting thing about brain research is the ability of the research to show how plastic the brain is. And by plastic, we mean it can rewire itself. And so all of us are learning and growing every day. And when we learn and we grow and when we learn new skills and we acquire new knowledge, our brain changes in different ways. And when we give kids who are struggling with reading, whether they have dyslexia or not, when they're struggling with reading, we give them some really good instruction, their brain rewires itself. When you have an individual with dyslexia who gets some good instruction, what we see is changes in the brain. And those changes result in somewhat more normalization of the brain, but really just more efficiency in terms of being able to read the word. So that is the good news in terms of brain plasticity, and the good news in terms of what it is that we know about the role of effective instruction and intervention in the brain. So kids with dyslexia, what do they need? They're going to need some instruction that's going to emphasize this phonology. And one of the most efficient and effective ways to do that is through decoding instruction, in which you are having students map individual speech sounds to letters and letter combinations.
Characteristics of dyslexia. Preschool children may be late in learning to talk, have limited vocabulary or inconsistent memory for words, and have difficulty learning the alphabet. When children start school, early indicators of dyslexia may include difficulty producing rhyming words, hearing and manipulating individual speech sounds and spoken words, remembering the names of letters and recalling them quickly, recalling the sounds that letters represent, recognizing common words by sight or automatically, and mapping sounds of letters for spelling. By the time students reach second or third grade, their difficulties separate them from their peers. They continue to have difficulty with reading, writing, and spelling. Upper elementary students will have trouble with oral reading fluency, reading quickly and accurately, and tasks such as note-taking, time management, and organization can become an issue. Characteristics.
So this is one, I know this is a question that Dr. Lindstrom gets all the time as well, is really what are the characteristics and what is it, either I'm a parent or I'm a teacher or an administrator and there are students. And so what is it, what are the things that we should be looking at? When we look at our early childhood, students who have delays in language and speech difficulties often go hand in hand because you can realize now that you have this body of knowledge about phonology, that individuals who are having difficulty with phonology and definitely hearing and processing those sounds are going to have difficulty then mapping those sounds to language. So again, we see early language plays a critical role in the development of, we say maybe dyslexia characteristics. By preschool, this is usually where it becomes more apparent. So when I have colleagues or friends, or mostly just have family members, when you've got preschool kids and they'll say, what do you think? Typically what I'll do is I'll sit down and I'll play with the kids a little bit and really just look at their ability to play with language. So kids who have difficulty with rhyming, if they're having difficulty remembering their letters and kind of hooking onto that as a concept, that can be a predictor. Recognizing common words, all of those things are some indicators that there's some delay, there's something that's happening that could be a sign of dyslexia. Then what happens by the time kids hit second or third grade, it becomes very apparent. And so by second or third grade, it's slow, it's laborious reading, terrible spelling with writing. Sometimes I'll have a second or third grade parent say, because I'll kind of ask about these phonology things, and they'll say, oh yeah, and I was like, well, what about spelling? And they're like, oh, the spelling is fine. And then I have to separate, wait a minute, do they pass a weekly spelling test in which they've memorized these words, or in their own writing is their spelling fine? So when you see in their own writing, if they have difficulty with spelling, that's more going to be a sign than, you know, the kid who tried really, really hard and could memorize all 10 of those words on that weekly spelling list is less of an indication than the kids in their natural writing have difficulty with spelling. So those are some of the characteristics that you might see of individuals with dyslexia. I kind of skipped through that kindergarten first grade level because sometimes what you'll see, which is particularly problematic, is that kid will hit first grade and teachers, or kindergarten or first grade, and teachers will say, oh, and the parent might say, you know what, his brother was reading at this point, or his sister knew all of her letter sounds at this point. And the teacher will say, oh, all kids are different and they'll catch up. Give them some time, give them some time to wait. And this really isn't good advice because what we know is that these skills can be taught, and there isn't sort of this natural unfolding that this is a code that needs to be taught. And so the sooner we can start teaching students the code, the better off it is. They're not going to just naturally pick up on it if they're not getting it already. They're going to need some more intensive intervention. And what we also know is that the earlier we get intervention, the better off it is. And so we can make great gains when we give kids really early and intensive intervention. When we get into older students, and we've got our third graders and on up, I taught middle school special education. So once we hit these older kids, and a couple of people mentioned this kind of in the questions coming in, that you get some motivation issues. It just gets a lot more difficult to remediate because it just gets difficult to teach at this point. And so it is completely possible and feasible, and all kinds of kids learn to read at 3rd grade and middle school and high school and as adults. But sometimes you got to kind of plow through some other stuff to get to the point where they can really be developing their decoding abilities and gaining some fluency with words and really engaging in some reading of connected text. All right, and I'm just looking, every now and then I try to look over at these questions. And before I go, there's a question that came in about, is dyslexia exclusive to English language speakers and readers? And that's such a great question. And the answer is no. And there's some really fascinating research about the brain on this. And in particular, I'm going to back up just a little bit. So we talked about English. We talked about the English orthography, which is how the English language is written, right? And so there are some languages that are more transparent than others. And what transparency means is that kind of one-to-one correspondence between a phoneme in your language and a letter that you have. And so some languages, there's a very transparent orthography, which means you learn one sound, you learn one letter. And so you'll see less. So it's fewer instances of dyslexia. But there was a really interesting study that was done in Italy, and there are very few instances. There's fewer people identified with dyslexia in Italy. There are fewer cases of dyslexia in Italy. And so, but they were going to study this. And so what they found, so they got these brain imaging scans of individuals who were struggling a little bit. So they were still fluent readers in Italian, but they were struggling a little bit enough that they could kind of just think that they weren't like the rest of the population, but they still were okay. And then they compared those with brain scans of individuals from other countries, particularly the UK and the United States. And what they found were same brain patterning. So what's the problem is that the issue in the brain and the organization of the brain that results in dyslexia and a more opaque transparency like English is going to be much more pronounced. So dyslexia is everywhere, and this brain difference, this difference in the brain and the difference in how the brain is organized is going to be universal, and yet you're just going to see it be more prevalent in different languages. The Italy study, I stole that from Duhan too. I steal all my stuff from Duhan. So I will definitely share that with you.
Reading is the process of mapping speech to print. Learning to talk comes naturally for most kids. Babbling becomes words, and words become sentences. Kids imitate what they hear and slowly begin to speak like those around them. The same does not happen for reading. Writing is a code. To learn to read, students must be taught the code. The sounds of language, which they already know from speaking, must be mapped to the letters and letter combinations on the page. To understand what a word means after it has been read requires knowledge of language. Therefore, the simple view of reading holds that the ability to read is the product of one's ability to decode text and one's ability to understand language. When a person encounters difficulty with either decoding or language comprehension, difficulties arise. Let's review. Who are individuals with dyslexia? Individuals with dyslexia are those who experience difficulty with accurate and fluent word reading. Are students with dyslexia served under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act? Yes, students with dyslexia can be served under the category of specific learning disabilities. Almost half of the students receiving special education services are served under this category. The majority of them experience difficulty with reading. Do individuals with dyslexia read backwards? No, this is the most common myth about dyslexia. Individuals with dyslexia have difficulty mapping the speech sounds to letters. This makes it difficult for them to read and spell. The difficulty associated with seeing a letter and not being able to process the sound or not being able to write a letter for a sound can be confusing for a person to describe. As a result, the idea of mixing up letters on a page became shorthand for describing difficulties with phonology. Are the brains of individuals with dyslexia different? Yes. Neurologists have found overactivation of some areas and underactivation of other areas of the brain. The overactivation is why it can be physically taxing for someone with dyslexia to try and read. Their brains are not being efficient, causing a great expenditure of effort for the person trying to read. Can individuals with dyslexia learn to read? Yes. Direct teaching of the code can help rewire the brains of individuals with dyslexia. Although reading may be slower, tremendous gains in reading and spelling performance can be made. Funding for the Dyslexia series was provided by the Reading is the Process.
All right, so we're going to wrap up because I know we started a little bit late and I want to give Jennifer some time to answer questions, like 5.5 minutes. But I do want to say that what we'll do in the next series is get a lot more into reading development, which is going to cover all of these things about how learning to read is not natural, and the role of explicit instruction and how important instruction is for getting students to really understand that code.
Okay, thank you, Kristen. That was amazing. I know that there are some more questions, so I will try to. What I have done here is I tried to think about the information that was shared tonight, the unraveling of the first video in the dyslexia series, and also try to think about the most common questions I receive from educators, from parents, from administrators. So if you can go back. Yeah, there we go. Okay, and try to tie it back to, because a lot of times I hear from parents or teachers, okay, but what does all this mean in the classroom? And one of the most common points of confusion, I'm actually probably not going to go in order because I want to make sure I talk about this, is the idea of the term dyslexia. So can you say dyslexia in the schools? Can the school say the word dyslexia, school personnel? Can parents talk about dyslexia? And the answer is an overwhelming yes, yes, yes. You can talk, you can say the word dyslexia, but it does help to think about how you're using it. So the law, if for those of you who are in Georgia, and this applies to many other states as well, requires screening for characteristics of dyslexia. And as Kristen provided that overview of even before children enter school, what are some of those characteristics? So how can we actually screen for those and measure for those indicators that would predict later reading difficulties and or potentially a diagnosis of dyslexia? So the screening process in the schools, we are looking for characteristics of dyslexia. And what that means and what that's looked like so far in the pilot, it's looked different. The process has been different, which we expected, and which has been very helpful because it's going to help us develop clear guidance on at what point we need to decide whether a student is showing characteristics of dyslexia, but that it's not synonymous with a diagnosis. So that early screening is showing red flags, and then the school needs to respond accordingly through targeted intervention. That can happen at any tier. That might be in tier 1 that the student is identified for a need of additional or more intensive intervention. What we have found also across the board, and this is happening nationally, as you may have been seeing in more of the popular press and other outlets, that we're really needing to look more closely at tier 1 reading instruction too, to make sure, and as Kristen said, that it's not just a result of or an artifact of poor reading instruction, that it's truly dyslexia. So that's why we need to go through that tiered process to make sure that these students are being provided with appropriate intervention. So when we get into whether a student is diagnosed with dyslexia, well, schools don't diagnose. So they go through the student would be identified or referred for evaluation for potentially determination for specific learning disability under which dyslexia falls. So there's this continuum. So you can have characteristics and not be eligible for special ed, or you can have characteristics and then be eligible for special ed. It just depends on severity and what the progress monitoring data show. And we're going to get into this in subsequent presentations, but I just wanted to clear that up. So when you're asking, can I request an evaluation for dyslexia in the school? It's really a two-part answer. Your child should be screened for dyslexia, especially across the state beginning in 2024-25. But if you're asking for an actual comprehensive evaluation, that would suggest, or that means you're asking for my child to be evaluated for eligibility for special education determination under the umbrella of specific learning disability. So there is a slight difference in how we're using that term dyslexia. Which also is similar to this second bullet. My child has an outside diagnosis of dyslexia, but does not qualify for an IEP. So it really has to do with severity, and if the student, by definition or by law, requires individualized differentiated instruction, that would then the student would be eligible for special education. And I addressed the evaluation. And then Kristen already addressed what are other types of learning disabilities besides dyslexia under that larger umbrella term, specific learning disability. And yes, an adolescent or adult can be diagnosed with dyslexia, and that is not uncommon. Hopefully, with all of the legislation that is being passed across the United States, not just in Georgia, we're going to see a decline in that happening because we are catching these students much earlier and providing much more effective evidence-based reading instruction from the outset in our core instruction. Okay, so that is, I just want to see, we're at 8:03, so we do have a couple minutes for additional questions if Nicole or others want to decide which ones we're going to be answering.
Actually, thank you, Dr. Lindstrom. There was a couple of questions that I think could be grouped together really quickly because I want to be very cognizant of your time tonight, but it was around comorbid diagnosis. So how does this screening work for students who have other things going on, like maybe they are hearing impaired or they have a visual impairment or they have other things? How will the screening look for them is the question.
So there's not a separate process right now, as identified in SB 48, which is the law in Georgia, the dyslexia law that Kristen mentioned earlier. There's not specific guidelines or guidance for students with comorbid disabilities like a visual impairment or a hearing impairment. And the process, again, so thinking about the larger process of MTSS that we follow in the schools in Georgia, those students would be screened in the same way. So they don't have a separate screening process, and they would be likely, if they show indicators or difficulties with reading, those would be identified and addressed as any other student would, and simultaneously be receiving support and accommodations for their already identified disability. But that is one of the, so we'll be sharing the outcome and results of the 3-year pilot. That report is due December 1st. And we're going to be including some oversights of the bill, and that's one of them, that it doesn't specifically or explicitly address those students with those other impairments.
There's one other quick question, and that was regarding, this person was saying that sometimes in their experience, dyslexia is often confused with students having an auditory deficiency. Can you just address that for 1 second?
Kristen, do you want to take this one, or?
Sure. And I think there's a couple of ways to, and Jennifer, feel free to hop in on this one. But so if you think about that issue with phonology, well, first of all, the first thing that you want to look at is you want to look at what we would sometimes call, your sensory issues, right? So again, is it an issue with vision? So like kindergarten Kristen, do I just need glasses, right? And that's going to clear things up and suddenly I can see letters and that's going to help me read. Or is it an issue with hearing? And so if I have difficulty hearing things, obviously I'm going to have difficulty. But I think when you start talking about auditory things, we start to getting into this notion of auditory processing. So clearly when we think about difficulties that students have processing the phonology of language, that kind of gets at some of those auditory issues. But sometimes people are separating that out and looking at that maybe as a separate cognitive issue. In the next series, we're going to kind of begin to unpack sort of these different layers of cognitive layers in terms of obviously attention is going to play a role. And I saw that was one of the questions that came up in the chat too, is that all of these things are going to pay attention. And so a student's ability to pay attention, and you can be a good reader. And if you're not really paying attention, you just have to go back and reread because you just weren't paying attention to anything you read. So there are other cognitive factors that get in there, but this notion of auditory processing becomes a little bit more difficult in terms of then how that's actually being measured, and it's being measured separately from this issue of phonology. Jennifer, you want to?
I don't have anything more to add. That was very comprehensive. Thank you.
Well, I just want to thank both of you so much on behalf of all of us here tonight. This was so informative and so helpful, and thank you for such a lovely and informative presentation. And I just want to remind everyone that there will be the next webinar coming up, and that is on the 16th of November. And you can just go ahead and sign up for that as well. And the slide deck will be shared. Thank you, Dr. Sayeski, for that. And this has been recorded, and it will also be shared as well. So anyone, when you registered, you signed up with an email, and it will be sent to your email. So thank you again, Dr. Sayeski, Dr. Lindstrom. We really appreciate it. This was absolutely fabulous.
Yes, and of course, feel free to send direct questions as follow-up if we didn't have a chance to answer all of your questions. Thank you, everybody.
Yep.